Thank you so much, High Commissioner Bachelet. It's a real pleasure for me to talk to you and talk about the issues that the world is facing and from the vantage point that you see it as High Commissioner for Human Rights. Obviously, in other years, you would be in New York. I happen to be in New York today. You're in Geneva at the headquarters today. I'm curious, this has not been the year we expected to see in 2020. What has COVID-19 meant for the state of human rights around the world?
Well, I think not only the health crisis, but also the consequences of the pandemics, and talking about the social, economic, and cultural consequences, has been pretty devastating. Because, first of all, you have had people who have not had access to health adequately because of the lack of investment for many years in health services in many parts of the world, but also because of they lost their jobs, their livelihoods, many people in the informal economy, and they lived on the daily basis, and you're telling them to lock down themselves, to not go out, they have curfews, etc. So it has meant for a lot of people lots of devastating consequences on one hand. The second thing that some governments have used COVID-19 as an excuse to introduce exceptional measures that are accepted according to the international human rights law, but it should be, for example, to restrict the freedom of assembly, because you cannot have so many people together, or to restrict the freedom of mobility and those. But there's no excuse to restrict the freedom of expression or the freedom of the press. And we have seen in places where the media, journalists have been attacked, accused of fake news. It's not really fake news because they're criticizing the government's policies in response to the pandemic. But the impacts are disproportionately affecting certain groups, the more vulnerable ones. And we're talking about older people, we're talking about women and girls, we're talking about LGBTI communities, we're talking about people living with disabilities, we're talking about migrants, refugees, IDPs.
Yeah, there's so many interesting points that you've just raised, and I'd love to sort of unpack a couple of them. But perhaps let's start with I think the rights that were well established in the 20th century and even before. As you point out, suddenly this pandemic is an excuse for governments to clamp down on freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and the like. How do we keep the spirit of human rights alive? Are you finding that certain things are bringing the human rights community together? Are there aspects that we should be thinking about this week around the UN General Assembly that we need to make sure we're doing even more of in the next year or so to ensure that we don't see something that was supposed to be temporary become more permanent?
Well, when I came to this post, I realized that there was a big backlash against human rights. I was not aware that it was so big, this political issue. Because of course I've always been involved with human rights, but I believe in human rights, so I didn't have that contradiction. So then I thought maybe this pandemic will play a role like it was the Second World War on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because the humanity said, no, we cannot go back to something like this. So we need to build a universal declaration, and we need to build sort of a global conditions that we can all coexist peacefully and in a better way. So I was hoping optimistically that this could happen, that there will be a global solidarity, global cooperation, but that does not happen. Has not happened. Every country has tried to solve their problem by their own, and I understand every head of state and head of government needs to have a responsibility over their nation, but I don't see that people have understood that unless everyone's safe, no one is safe. And this will be a very important discussion with the vaccine as well. How you ensure that the 7 billion people can receive the vaccine, otherwise it will be always, because of the mobility, a constant risk. So how we convince everyone that we need to work together, it's a very difficult thing, but we are making advocacy the whole day, preaching, if I may say, in terms of how important it is. The other thing that is interesting, and let me pass the commercial, if I may say, on the 12 countries that did it better, 8 or 9 were led by women. So I hope that it will mean also to ensure that the Building Back Better also gives women the place in the world that they really deserve. because we don't only need to applaud the health workers, that the majority of health workers are women, but also we need to see that women can be in can be in the private sector, can be in the politics, in everywhere, and they can do well.
No, I think that's such a good point. And the irony, as you suggest, is this is a virus that does not discriminate, as you said, against different kinds of people. It doesn't discriminate based on nationality. It doesn't even understand when there is a border. And yet, we have governments turning inwards rather than acting collectively. I'm struck because one of the defining issues of the 21st century has quickly become climate, sustainability. And that has these same characteristics. In fact, I would venture that in the year 2030, we'll probably be spending more time talking about climate issues than COVID issues. At least we should all hope that's the case for sure. As you look to the future, is that becoming a human rights issue as well? What does the whole set of climate issues mean for human rights around the world?
Climate change, the problem is not only that climate change in itself is a threat, and it's a threat for human rights, because you see today people who are fighting, for example, for water or for land, and they are killing themselves in some parts of Africa. Right? This intercommunal violence, and many times because of that, and many times they have to fly away from their places because the sea levels have gone so high that they have lost their livelihoods and so on. So it's not in the future. Today, climate change is producing a lot of impacts on human rights. And we have a lot of internal displaced people, and of course migrants as well, and refugees, but mainly internal displaced people. And we need to ensure that then the agreements that we have, the world was able to get into a consensus like the Paris Agreement really makes a difference. And the COP, well, this year it won't be in Glasgow, it will be next year, that we will really be able to find solutions to the Kyoto Protocol and so on, so we can really advance on climate action, because that's what we need, climate action. On the other hand, I think it's fundamental the commitment that companies can have with that as well, because the economy can be cleaner, the energy can be cleaner.
It's so interesting that you mentioned companies and the private sector. Here we are celebrating the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. And when the UN was created, when the Universal Declaration on Human Rights was adopted in 1948, I think the focus of the world was almost entirely on the role and the impact of governments when it came to human rights. And yet your office in recent years has really focused more on the role of business and the responsibility of business when it comes to human rights. For those of us who work in the business community, what is your message to us about what you would like to see us thinking about, and what would you like to see us doing when it comes to the protection of human rights?
It's the right thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do, because you can avoid reputational risk and other kind of stuff. So I think companies should continue with, according to these principles, working on not only on the headquarters, but also through all the supply chain to ensure that human rights are protected. On the other hand, in the tech companies in particular, for example, I think there's a lot of things that can be done in terms of artificial intelligence or other kind of digital technologies that can support either the efforts of the governments or other efforts to respond to the pandemic, for example, because the pandemic has shown the importance of this digital space. So I think we need responsible leadership with a commitment to international standards.
I think it's really an important point that you make about the responsibilities that all of us in the business community have. And obviously, I think especially those of us who work in the largest companies that have a multinational reach, those of us who work in the technology sector. One of the things that COVID has reminded us of is the degree to which we're reliant on technology today. I mean, literally, people have been able to go to school or not sometimes based on whether they had an internet connection. And it just causes me to wonder, how do we think about the evolution of human rights? When the Universal Declaration was written, no one had heard of the word internet. How do you think about access to the internet? How do you think about access to broadband? Should we be thinking of these as part of human rights today?
I completely think so. It's part of the SDGs, to ensure access to internet for all. And I think it's so essential because we knew that they're part of the world where there's no access to internet, not access to digital technology, they're not illuminated. But on the other hand, it makes a whole difference. And I was mentioning before that from the 1.6 billion learners, students, almost 500 million don't have access. For them, it's clearly a big loss. So it's a big concern that we could have a loss of a generation in some countries. And we saw with Ebola that it's very difficult when children lose a school. I mean, in 160 countries, they have to close the schools. Many times they don't go back to school because they start working in the rural area with the family. So I think it's crucial that we ensure that access to internet, it's like it's a human right. I don't know, we don't need necessarily to write again the Universal Declaration of Human Rights because we say that same things should be ensured online and offline. So yes, but I think it's really a human right, and we have seen the differences between and how much the digital divide can mean in terms of the future for young children.
One last question I wanted to ask you that I think builds on this. You've been such an important champion for the rights of women as well as the rights of everyone. But as you think about the rights of women in 2020 and the issues around this pandemic, we're increasingly seeing more challenges for women. We're seeing in some countries, women feeling that they can't continue to work because the burden of educating their children at home is falling disproportionately on them. As you look around the world in September of 2020, what's your assessment of the issues that we need to be focusing on most in order to sustain the protection of the rights of women?
Well, I think we have a big risk of going backwards in terms of progress of gender women in the labor market. First of all, is that we have seen increase of violence, again, domestic violence, because being in the home in confinement with the perpetrator of violence has meant that a lot of women has been victims, and the numbers of femicides and violence against women has increased dramatically all over the world. It's not only in South, not all over the world. The second thing is that unfortunately women are very often work in many of these areas where they were more affected because of the economic lockdown, if I may say, and the tourism, gastronomy, and so on. The third is that majority of the informal economy, and we're talking about almost more than 70% of workers of the world work in informal economy, and 70% are women. If we want to build back better, we need to ensure that women can have access to work. So there's a lot of different things that we need to do in ensuring that women can have access. But on the other hand, I'm a pediatrician, so I think countries who want women to be able to have a better possibility in life and a better job, because many times also women and although sisters has to be in charge of children, it's to have kindergartens that can be provided so women can have their kids taken care of, nurseries and kindergarten. This is one of my beloved programs when I was president, and it really works because you can develop all the capacities of a kid since he's very small, even if he comes in a very vulnerable family who have no education and so on. But then in those places you can have a safe learning, and it can also provide the possibility for women to work.
Well, I think what you're really describing in so many ways is just the importance of the human rights issues we're seeing this year. I mean, let's face it, 2020 is not an easy year for the world. And I think it's an even more important year than many others for the state of human rights around the world. So in closing, I just want to say thank you, not just for the time that you're spending in conversation with me today, but thank you for the role that you're playing, leading the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Thank you for the work of everyone in Geneva and literally around the world who's part of the UN Human Rights team. I think we need you now more than ever, but the truth is we need you every year, and the world's a better place because of what you do. So thank you very much.
And thank you, Brad, for what you do supporting the protection, promotion of human rights, individually, of course, but also as part of the company, but also, of course, as part of the business and human rights. So thank you so much for that.